Hello, guys. So we left off last time with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, a coordinated attack by North Vietnamese communists all over the major cities of the South. And you can see by that map with the red stars on it, most of them are in the southern part, including the capital, Saigon, including a special attack on the United States Embassy in Saigon. And two crucial factors about Vietnam that I think made a huge difference. If you think about it today, when is the last time we saw footage from Afghanistan, of troops on the ground in Afghanistan? When is the last time we saw anything from Iraq or Syria or any place else in the world? We don't see it. Two crucial things I think that made a big difference in Vietnam is this was telecast live, as I mentioned. We did not have reporters embedded. They went anywhere they wanted to. And we saw live footage. We saw people blown up. We saw people executed. We saw atrocities. We saw it live. It made a huge difference. If we saw 10 minutes of live footage from Afghanistan today, would it change public opinion? Probably it would, but we don't see it. The other factor that made a huge difference is the draft. In the beginning of the war, we drafted, because we didn't have enough volunteers, 21 to 30-year-olds, later on 18 to 45-year-olds. So by 68, 69, at the peak of the war, we have tens of thousands of 18-year-olds going to Vietnam with some training. They were not untrained, but thrown into a guerrilla war, which we have not fought, and into a jungle war, which we have not fought since the Philippines 70 years earlier. The difference is we have an all-volunteer army today. We do not hear about it, but the same 1% of the public population oftentimes goes 3, 4, 5 tours of duty in Afghanistan, Iraq, or other places. This was very different. We don't pay attention unless we have somebody in the military right now. In Vietnam, everybody paid attention because it was a draft, and it was a draft by lottery. And you can see a couple slides down that big tumbler with the little things in it. That was the lottery. The lottery was done by your birth date. So they put 365 little balls in a bin, they rolled it around, and somebody pulled a little ball out. And if you were March 23rd, that was, you were number one in the draft. And then they'd pull another one, and you might be September 28th. And they would keep pulling numbers from 1 to 365. If you were under 150, you were going to Vietnam, pretty sure. If you were over 250, 275, you were safe. It was completely random. Everybody watched the television set that night when they drew that lottery. Everybody was concerned about Vietnam because everybody knew somebody who was in Vietnam or going to be drafted in Vietnam, because it was completely at random. In the beginning, there was a deferment. You didn't have to go if you were in college. So who is fighting this war? African Americans, minorities, very high percentage. Not completely, but a very high percentage. Many of their junior commanders were white college graduates who had gone through the ROTC program or military academy, and they didn't always get along because they're out in Vietnam, and you are sending me out into the jungle to look for Vietnamese communists where the death rate was extremely high on both sides. Some effects of the draft, besides everybody paying attention, the voting age was lowered to 18 in 1971. The drinking age happened to be 21 at the time. The drinking age was also lowered to 18. You can't send me to go and die for my country if I can't go buy a beer in the store. So voting age was also lowered for obvious reasons. Drinking age was lowered. Death penalty, ironically, was also lowered to the age of 18. So 18 became the age of an adult instead of 21, which it had been before. Side effect of this, when the drinking age was lowered to 18, car accident rates went up about 25%. So interesting side effect of that. Okay, so we are still working with the original slide, the 1960s slide. Moving on into that, the file, 60s slide, 60s file. Slide number 45 talks about the New Left and the anti-war movement. Homogenous country in the 1950s. In the 1960s, we have nothing but chaos. We have a number of assassinations. We have the civil rights movement and a lot of violence there. And we have Vietnam. Once news started to get back from Vietnam, once it became televised, nightly televised on the evening news, and again, there's no cable, everybody was watching the same 3 channels, there is a movement against not only Vietnam, but called the counterculture, against the dominant culture. They are counter against the dominant culture. And this really started in the 50s because everybody was supposed to be homogenous, everybody was supposed to be the same, and there were people like the early beat poets, Jack Kerouac, that fought against this. In the 1960s, Vietnam really triggered the counterculture movement. Comes out of the 50s, originally comes out of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, once African Americans are killed and injured in that movement, Black Power movement came out of the civil rights movement, which was completely nonviolent passive resistance at first, and the Black Power movement is a splinter movement out of it. Don't want to spend too much time on this, but again, in Vietnam, many African American soldiers. African Americans were 10% of the American population and 20% of the casualties in Vietnam. They were the foot soldiers. So Black Power movement basically was Black control of Black areas. We don't want to cooperate with whites. We want to do it ourselves. And every Southern white's nightmare, Black men with guns, because they began to arm. The other branch of this were student protests for obvious reasons. When the draft age is lowered to 18, you don't get out as you did originally with a student deferment. So students began to organize. It began from the civil rights. They learned from participating in civil rights, and they just transferred it over to their own movement, basically. There's a great quote. Okay, here's from a leader of Students for a Democratic Society. Last summer, I went to Mississippi to fight for civil rights. This fall, I'm in the same struggle against a powerful minority that rules through organized violence to suppress the vast, powerless majority. As we all know, students have almost no power. Neither do faculty either, for that matter. But students clearly have no power, or almost none. So this was a movement originally against the war, but also for their own democratic rights. And then the last branch of that, of course, are the hippies. There's a number of slides there. There's Woodstock. We all recognize some of those things. And again, this was a movement against the dominant culture. All of these movements coalesced behind the anti-war movement. And they began to march in the streets, led by students, led by civil rights leaders, against the war. A crucial turning point is when veterans came back from Vietnam and began to organize against the war. They saw firsthand what was going on and said this had to stop. So Vietnam Veterans Against the War was a crucial block, and people began to listen when they started marching. Okay, I'm moving to the file Nixon and on, and the first slide in there is text talking about the 1968 election. This is in the spring and summer of 68. LBJ withdrew early summer in 68. 4 days after he withdrew, Martin Luther King is killed. So there is chaos in 68. LBJ refused to run. Democratic convention was in Chicago. I was still in Chicago, living there at the time, and that convention was totally chaos. There was literally blood in the streets. You had student protesters, you had the Chicago police, which were never known for their diplomatic skills, cracking heads in the street. I did not participate in those demonstrations. I did in others, but not in those, but I had friends who were there and who were injured, actually, from my high school. So who is running? You have Democrats are split here. You have, and you have a number of slides there, the first couple of slides there, 2 to 6. You have Hubert Humphrey, who was the moderate, mainline conservative candidate. He had been LBJ's vice president. He's the party favorite. You have Gene McCarthy, Clean Gene, he was called. He was openly an anti-war liberal and got a very large percentage of the votes, of the popular vote. You also have a third Democratic candidate, Bobby Kennedy, slides 5 and 6. Bobby Kennedy was called the Great White Hope. He is openly anti-war. He is openly in favor of the poor and the underclass. In personal opinion, I consider him the best of the Kennedy brothers. He didn't fool around with women. He really seriously interacted with poor people and was concerned about their welfare. Unfortunately, the day that he wins the California primary, and of course, California is a huge state. If you win the California primary, your odds are good you're going to win the Democratic nomination. He is giving his acceptance speech to his supporters. He walks off the stage, and a guy assassinates him. So again, this is another assassination 4 or 5 months after Martin Luther King. The world is in chaos. So this was really despair for my generation. Bobby Kennedy was young. He was charismatic. He was a Kennedy. We had hopes that he could unite the country. He could pull us out of the quagmire. And he's assassinated. You have other candidates. There is an independent running, George Wallace, who was governor of Alabama, Southerner, got support from poor whites. His entire platform is segregation now, segregation forever. He got a significant number of votes, was not elected, of course, and coincidentally, there is also an assassination attempt on him shortly thereafter. He was not killed, but he spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. So the guns are out in the 1960s. This is the beginning of chaos. We have more today, but this is when it starts. The Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, he's back again. I put that in. He had been Eisenhower's vice presidential candidate, run against Kennedy, lost by a very narrow margin, disappears for 8 years, comes back, and he's running again as the Republican candidate in 1968. His platform, his ideas, very vague. Absolutely. He saw anybody who criticized him as an enemy, and he was totally willing to use any tactic necessary. Does any of this sound familiar? He actually got 43% of the popular vote. So he is a minority candidate again. He does not win over 50% of the vote, but he wins in the Electoral College. Nixon has a number of problems once he is elected. First of all, you have Vietnam still going on, and you have America as the number one military power, but traditionally Republicans are small government guys. How do you conduct a war and have small government at the same time? It's physically impossible. So big military, small government are mutually exclusive, and Nixon has this problem. He has some economic inflation. He has high unemployment. There's a recession during his term. Other kinds of domestic issues. How did he win the presidency? He used what he called his Southern strategy, and this is when the South begins to shift to the Republican Party. The solid South was completely Democratic, remember, anti-Lincoln, anti-Republican, until Nixon. And now, of course, the South is largely Republican. So the Southern strategy, you win the South for the Republican Party. How do you do that? You play the race card. You use flat out racism. Once LBJ and the Democrats supported civil rights, Southern whites are looking for a place to go, and the Republican Party courted them. And it worked, and it's worked ever since then. So Richard Nixon did some significant things domestically. He did some wage and price controls. He also did, of all things, some environmental regulations. The Clean Water Act is under Richard Nixon, surprisingly enough. But he is very famous for international affairs of what he did overseas. This was his primary focus, and he was very effective. So good and bad things about Nixon, but internationally he was pretty good. His Secretary of State is Henry Kissinger. I have a slide there, slide number 8. The guy standing in front of Nixon is Henry Kissinger. Because of what he did in Vietnam, my generation considers him a war criminal. He was a German refugee from World War II, and his phrase was Realpolitik in German, real politics. No ideology, completely pragmatic. What works for America is what we will do. So Vietnam is the first thing. What are you going to do about Vietnam when Nixon is elected? There are over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. Nixon personally was a hawk pro-war. LBJ personally, his personal opinion was anti-war, and somehow LBJ gets labeled with the Vietnam War, and Nixon, oddly enough, is the guy who got us out of Vietnam. How did he do this? He slowly withdraws troops. By the time he left office, there were only 30,000 troops from over 500,000 in 1972. He called it Vietnamization. We are going to turn the war over to the South Vietnamese. Now, of course, we were giving them tons of military equipment. We were also training their officers to run their own army. This had mixed results, but public supported it because the minute you reduce the draft, the minute that you reduce the need for men, you reduce the resistance to the war. So boots on the ground were replaced by more bombing. As one critic said, Nixon changed the color of the carcasses on the battlefield. That was his accomplishment. In April of '69, under Nixon, neutral Cambodia was bombed, carpet bombed. You see a slide of Cambodia there, and those little red things are bomb sites, bomb targets. This was carpet bombing, which literally means just bomb everything. And we could do it. We have the armaments. This was secretly done. Now, how do you do this secretly? It's almost impossible. The word got out immediately. Nixon denied it, but the word got out. We are carpet bombing Cambodia, and the campuses across the country, university campuses, erupted in protests. Kent State, slides 14 and 15, were an anti-war protest in response to the bombing in Cambodia. And National Guard troops were called out in Kent State, which is a public university in Ohio. For some reason, they were given live bullets. And according to witnesses, the protest was by all accounts peaceful, and something happened. The troops felt threatened. They opened fire. 4 students were shot dead. 2 more in a Mississippi college. 2 of those in Kent State were involved in the student protest. 2 of them were just walking by, going to classes on campus. This really shakes up a lot of parents. I send my kid to college, and he's shot by our own troops in a peaceful protest. 1971, another country not directly involved with the war, Laos, is also bombed. This is an international issue and international regulations. Can a country bomb another one? It has been done. Is it legal? No, on international law, it is not legal. Why were we bombing Laos and Cambodia? We were also consistently bombing North Vietnam, but the more we bombed North Vietnam, the more they started sending supplies through paths in the jungle and the mountains in Laos and Cambodia. So these were supply routes, basically, that we were bombing. They were military targets. They had almost no effect. Again, 95% rural. How were supplies getting through? Most of the North Vietnamese were sending supplies through on backs of people. Occasionally horses and mules, but on the backs of people. There were no roads in these areas. So we would try and find the paths, we would try and find the trails, we would bomb them. Groups of North Vietnamese communist youth would camp along the trails. The minute an area was bombed, they would immediately run out overnight and rebuild the trail so it was ready the next day for more troops. It was a hopeless task trying to stop supplies coming south. When we bombed Laos, our State Department said, there's no records of this, it never happened. It's impossible to keep it quiet. Our bombers, our guys are bombing it. The word got out. So in 1970, late 72, after all of this chaos continues on campus, after all of this chaos continues in Vietnam and all over Southeast Asia, Henry Kissinger, our Secretary of State under Nixon, meets secretly with North Vietnamese leaders. They sign a truce in January of 73. Our agreement in the truce was that the United States would be out in 60 days. The other side, the Vietnamese communists,